The drowned rice terraces of the Philippine highlands, a lost agrarian dream. There are terraces, one is told, that do not ascend the mountains but sleep beneath the sea. Their steps, once shaped for water and grain, are now given over to currents and to silence. Listen softly to that notion for a moment. Imagine not a ruin thrown down by violence, but a place laid to rest as if by common consent, its furrows folded into blue. It is a curious fact that certain landscapes keep the rhythm of their labors long after the hands that tended them are gone. One might suppose the terraces continue to count the seasons in their sleep. Breathe in, slowly. Feel the coolness of early tidal breath. Hold it, as the diver holds the small, patient world beneath the surface, and let it go, as water lets go of light. The air here is thick with salt and calm, salt that remembers soil, and soil that remembers seed, so that memory becomes a taste. Tonight I will ask you to follow a gentle hypothesis, that fields can be forgotten by maps yet remembered by sound, that labor can become a kind of song which the sea, in its own way, knows how to sing back.
One might begin, quite simply, with water, for terraces are first of all an economy of falling water, a deliberate choreography that turns slope into a measured descent. Imagine, then, the sound of a channel being opened at dawn, a thin, deliberate hiss as a sluice is eased, the small metallic click of a wooden wedge against packed earth, and then the silver thread voice of water answering, at first tentative, then full, as it laces itself from tier to tier. And let that first sound sit in your mind, the slow, small music of irrigation, repeated 100, 1,000 times until the sound is not an action but a habit. Breathe. It is this habit, the habit of moving water with human patience, that will give shape to the terraces and indeed to the lives that habit enjoins. The terraces themselves are not, in imagination, monumental like pyramids or palaces. They are modest, technical, intimate. Think of stone risers, hand-laid, whose faces remember the tap of chisels and the thumb press of mortar, whose seams are softened by moss and the first green invisible to any hurried eye. Here, if you will, the rasp of the mason's tool, slow, the thunk of a stone settling into place, low and contented, the coughing, good-humored exchange among neighbors as they pass a length of bound bamboo. Each sound is brief, and yet the total effect is of a larger, communal instrument being tuned. It is a curious fact that such instruments are both robust and fragile, admirable in their engineering, delicate in their reliance upon hands and seasons. The morning irrigation is the terrace's heart song. From the mountain springs comes a coldness that smells faintly of iron and leaf. As it arrives, it cleanses the mirrors of the paddies, and the light, morning light, reads itself across these shallow plains as if the land had borrowed 1,000 small skies. One might suppose, in an idle fancy, that the terraces learned their taste for reflection from the sky itself, and in truth, the sight of a terrace at daybreak is a study in gentle geometry, a step, a shimmer, a bird's bright punctuation, and then another step, another shimmer, as if a ladder had been set for the sun to descend upon. Listen, the waters whisper on each earthen lip, the faint plash as a foot breaks the mirror, the murmur of voices, at first paused, then rising into the small chants that keep time with planting. These are not songs of exhibition. They are practical refrains, measured to the breath. The planting and the harvest are the seasons by which most lives here are counted. The labor is not heroic in the dramatic sense. It is patient, ritualized, and shared. Consider the harvest ritual. Women combine their hands into a choreography of small, exact movements. A sickle's careful arc, the measured shake of a handful of grain, the soft stamping to change the grain's rhythm. And with each action, a note of domestic music issues forth. The thud of a basket, the whisper of straw, a child's small delighted shout when a particularly heavy bundle thumps to the mat. Even the sorting of grain, endless and meticulous, produces a kind of percussion, beans tapping against basket rims, a soft sifting, a long, satisfied exhale. One is put in mind of a slow, communal hymn composed of thrift and tenderness. The evening watchfires complete the day's arc picture. If you will, farmers seated on a terrace's edge as dusk lays its hand upon the land. Their feet touch the tears like an instrument's strings. They speak in low cadences about the weather, about seeds and kin, but more often they speak in fragments, aphorisms that teach caution, that measure risk, that instruct a younger listener how to knot a sluice wedge properly. The small sound of a tinder being coaxed, the faint crackle of a fed ember, the quiet laugh that is half reprimand. These populate the acoustic life of the terrace as insistently as the water's channel. And above all, there is a lullaby that permeates, sometimes a child's game, sometimes a woman's low chant, that recapitulates the day's rhythm into song. Architecture here is audio as much as it is visual. The stones have memory. Their rubbing and settling in the night makes a soft music of their own. The ear learns, over many wet seasons, to read a wall's pitch, to hear a crack before one sees it, to anticipate a small repair. That economy of care, the annual patching of a riser before the rains, the relaying of a channel, is itself a social meter. It measures reciprocity, obliges neighbor to neighbor, and ties labor into obligation without drama. Their courts were not made of marble but of conversation. They adjudicated work schedules at the low hum of shared food. It is a curious fact, one that scholars sometimes neglect, that much of the social structure of such agrarian communities is bound up in the minute economies of maintenance. The people who tended these terraces possessed knowledge that spoke in practical aphorisms: when to dam a small inlet to coax more water into a thirsty basin, how to read the mountain's thin breath for signs of storm, the timing of planting to the moon's calendar when the winds would be gentler. Such knowledge is oral and tactile. It would never make an elegant chapter heading in a learned volume. But it is, perhaps, the most valuable kind of lore, the knowledge of doing. One might imagine an apprenticeship beginning at children's knees. They learn first to sit still upon a stone edge and watch the sluice, to count the seconds between the open wedge and the flow's arrival, to learn, by small imitation, the economy of breath that the labor demands. It is a matter of conjecture among modern historians whether these pedagogies were formalized into ritual. In any case, their effect on the landscape is unmistakable. The terraces shape humanity as much as humanity shapes the terraces. There is also artistry in the domestic. The manner of binding a bundle of grain, the knot that will resist the pulling of a laden donkey, the choice of a cord's twist, all aesthetic decisions as much as functional ones. These choices are modest, without the pretension of ornament. Still, they declare taste. You will hear that modest pride in the clack of a well-made basket lid or in the careful folding of a cloth used to carry seedlings. Taste likes to survive, and it does so here, transmitted murmuredly across terraces and through time. Patterns of embroidery that echo the terrace's step, a motif in a rope's weave that imitates the ridge of a stone riser. The domestic artifacts, a shallow pot, a carved paddle, an amulet, are not treasures in the archaeological sense of splendor, but they are treasures of habit, each with a small sound or texture that anchors memory. It is a quiet delight, in such a community, to note how labor and leisure overlap. A song that measures the proper timing of a sowing also soothes a sleeping child. A joke traded over mending a net doubles as an economizing mnemonic. These overlaps mean that the terraces are not merely places of work. They are theaters of living, where the script is distributed among many hands and voices, and where the rhythm of the day becomes a shared metronome. The sound of a child winding thread while elders speak of irrigation is as telling as any formal note in a learned chronicle, for it is the ordinary sound that history often neglects, and yet it is the sound that binds generation to generation. Yet the terrace's life includes occasional rites of larger scale, rites to mark the beginning of a long season, small processions to bless a new channel, the offering of first grain to the mountain spring in a gesture that is at once devotional and practical. These rites are modest in their ceremony. A bowl of steamed rice set on a rock, a chant hummed without fanfare, but they form a ritual scaffolding that keeps anxiety at bay and reinforces social cohesion. One might suppose these gatherings are as much about social repair as they are about spiritual appeasement, a moment to realign obligations, to remind neighbors of shared tasks, to sing the names of those absent. If one is attentive to the acoustic geography, one hears also the non-human chorus, the call and response of waterfowl at the marshy edge, the insect chorus that swells at dusk and subsides at midnight, the far-off, patient rumble of rain on distant ridges. These are not background noises in the pejorative sense. They are integral measures by which people time tasks. A seasoned farmer, listening, knows that a particular insect's pitch foretells a certain kind of storm. Such knowledge is, to the modern ear, arcane, but to those who live the terrace's life, it is direct counsel. We must, for a moment, imagine the social textures more precisely. The terraced village is a patchwork of cottages and common grounds, of low benches where nets are repaired and where elders tell fondly precise stories about droughts that were survived. Gendered labor is less rigid than some modern readers suppose. Men and women share tasks according to season and strength, and children are apprenticed into both song and work. There is, necessarily, a hierarchy of skill. Some are master masons for the risers, others are the keepers of channels, still others know how to select rice varieties suited to slightly salter soils. But these hierarchies are pragmatic and permeable. Skill is recognized in the tone of a voice more than in titles inscribed on stone. Trade and exchange threaded the terraces into wider networks. The villagers did not exist in hermetic isolation. They bartered grain for pottery, for metal tools, for salt that came from coastal hands. The sound of barter is gentle in that place. A proposed exchange, a thoughtful measurement of grain, a soft affirmative breath. Traders' voices were not loud hawks, but measured interlocutors. The sound of a boat's creak at a distant inlet, the hollow clunk of cargo against wood, the near silent counting of kernel by hand. These are the commerce sounds one should imagine. Indeed, commerce here is not an alienating force, but a connective tissue. It keeps the terrace's utilitarian economy alive and responsive to the sea beyond the ridgeline. And so, as the terraces rose step by crafted step, they became not only an achievement of engineering but a lived acoustic ecosystem, a place where the sounds of labor and leisure braided together into something that felt, to its inhabitants, like the most natural order. We imagine children learning the names of stones as naturally as they learn the names of birds. We imagine an elder whistling a contour so precisely that younger hands can copy it in the relaying of a channel. These sounds are modest, repetitive, and therefore profoundly lulling, a natural prelude to the uneasy part of our tale, for even the most patient of systems may encounter changes it cannot simply absorb. How then did this life come to be known as a dream when later generations found it sleeping underwater? Perhaps because it embodies a particular human attempt to order the world with small instruments and steady hands, and later, when that order altered, the terraces became an elegy for labor. But for now, in the world we have built in the mind, the terraces are alive with measured sound, water, tool, voice. Let your breath slow to match the cadence. Inhale, count 1 terrace. Exhale, settle. Inhale, another step. Exhale, repose. Hold these motions as if you were, yourself, learning to tend a field by listening rather than by seeing. It is a curious and useful exercise, before one attempts explanation, to attend to the tone of a disappearance, for disappearances do not all speak with the same accent. Some leave a sudden, clanging silence. Others evaporate as mist. The vanished terraces we are concerned with belong, I believe, to the latter category, a slow undoing that sounds, at first, like the gentle thinning of a weave rather than like any sudden ripping. How does one narrate such an unmaking without the drama that our modern imaginations crave? One does so by listening to the small changes, the altered cadence of a market, the rustle of a roof left unrepaired, the change in a lullaby's second verse when a season fails. Breathe. Hold the question lightly in your hands, as one might hold a pebble before dropping it into a quiet pool. There are, as in most inquiries that seek to balance poetry and record, multiple theories, not necessarily competing as much as harmonizing into accord. We shall consider 3 principal lines of thought, each presented with due restraint. First, the slow incursion of the sea. Second, the quieter business of social and economic withdrawal. And third, the possibility that the whole affair was partly a cultural contract, a negotiated yielding to change. These are not tidy hypotheses to be adjudicated by a single paragraph. Rather, they are tonal modes by which to listen to the past.
Theory the first, which I shall call the gentle drowning, is the kind that invites one to imagine time as a patient artisan. Sea level rise does not announce itself with trumpet calls. It arrives as an index of many small acts compounded over ages. Think, if you please, of the slow melting of distant glaciers. Think of the 1,000-year accretion of millimeters that, left unremarked in any single lifetime, alter the line of a coast. One might suppose, and many geologists now suppose with cautious phrasing, that a combination of post-glacial rebound and thermal expansion adjusted shorelines in such a way that lands once considered safe for terrace construction found themselves flirting with the salt. The physical signatures of such a process are modest but telling. The lower courses of stonework rimed with calcareous incrustation, the presence of marine sediments within layers that, in older maps, were irrigated paddies. If the sea came in such measured fashion, the acoustic consequences would be gradational. The sluice that once closed with a decisive wood-on-wood sound might begin to leak. The rice's taste for fresh water would struggle where brackishness crept. Yields would falter by degrees. The community's response to such a slow challenge is instructive and, in human terms, graceful. Adapt, move a channel uphill, attempt new cultivars, wait a season to judge. These are not dramatic gestures, but persistent, remedial ones. Over a generation or two, if the sea continues its patient advance, adaptation may become less feasible or less desirable than migration. Imagine the small conversations that accompany such decisions. A mother weighing the cost of repair against the joint's diminishing yield. A youth, restless, hearing in the distant town ships more attractive the chance to learn a trade less beholden to water. There is no single catastrophe here, only the arithmetic of millimeters rendered human. Theory the second, which might be termed the quiet unmaking of labor, shifts attention from sea to society. It is a matter of plain observation that human economies are supple. They trade labor where it finds greatest return. One must bear in mind that terracing, though ingeniously adapted to its place, is a labor-intensive form of agriculture. It is maintained by an ethic of collective care. What happens, then, when a sequence of poor yields, or an episode of illness, or an attractive new market elsewhere, begins to tip that calculus? Young men and women, practical as any of us, may decide to seek steadier wages in towns, on ships, or in emergent plantations. The elders, bound to place by memories and obligations, are left to patch what they can. Over time, the cumulative effect of outmigration is to thin the social fabric. Fewer hands to mend risers, fewer voices in the chorus that chants the rhythm of planting and harvest. Breathe, and imagine that thinning as a sound. The percussive knock of fewer baskets, the less frequent stamping of threshers, an empty seat at a hearth where there once was a small, habitual lament. It is a curious fact that the evidence for this route is often human scale and fragmentary. A register noting fewer signatures, a trader's ledger with declining orders from a particular village, an oral recollection in which an elder scratches a line of names and says, "They went down to the port in the year the rains failed." These records, though small, are persuasive in their cumulative weight. They suggest that the terraces could have been abandoned not because they became impossible to keep, but because their keepers, facing a multiplicity of economic options, chose to invest their energies elsewhere. One finds in such choices neither moral failing nor high drama, only the sober arithmetic of survival and aspiration. Theory the third introduces a different tone, the bargain with water, which sounds at first like myth and yet may contain a sociological truth. Many cultures conceive of landscape and water as morally animated. Offerings to springs, rituals to propitiate rain, and the placing of first fruits upon natural thresholds are common practices. There are narratives, whispered among coastally oriented peoples, that suggest a communal decision, ritual or pragmatic, to relinquish marginal land to the sea in exchange for the stability of core settlements inland. Such a contract could be literal, as in agreements to abandon certain terraces when they cease to be productive, or it could be metaphorical, a story told to make sense of loss. Either way, the narrative performs a social function. It translates ecological failure into a moral economy that preserves dignity. Thus, when an elder declares that the sea was fed, or that we gave those fields back, we should not dismiss the phrase as naive. Rather, we should hear it as a cultural strategy that allows communities to bury grief within ritual and to carry continuity in other forms. Each of these theories, ingress of water, migration of labor, ritual relinquishment, has its traces in the silences and the sediment. The archaeologist's stratigraphy will offer one kind of testimony, the economist's ledger another, the singer's lullaby yet another. In the practice of historical imagination, it is prudent, and indeed humane, to let these testimonies stand side by side. To insist upon a single cause impoverishes the past, To allow multiple voices to sing together invites a kind of truth made of harmonics rather than of a single, forcible line. How does one adjudicate among them? One listens. One attends to the timbre of the evidence. Consider, then, the kinds of small noises we might expect to find as precursors to disappearance. There is the noise of repair deferred, a mason's tool lying unused in a corner, a sluice wedge left loose because the person who knew how to make it is gone. There is the sound of market routes shifting, the creak of a dhow that no longer calls at a particular inlet, the less frequent bell at a distant port. And there are the acoustic traces of memory, songs with missing verses, proverbs that begin to change their metaphors from fields to boats, lullabies that introduce a new cadence as if to accommodate a long-anticipated absence. These are not the stuff of dramatic documentary, but of intimate testimony. They tell us that disappearance, when it belongs to human communities, is often more audible in what is left unsaid than in any conspicuously recorded event. There are also environmental signatures that speak in quieter voices. The terraces stones, when submerged over long periods, acquire a living patina. Certain foraminifera and molluscan incrustations leave a biological palimpsest that indicates prolonged marine conditions. Corals and algae that colonize stone create their own acoustic textures. The soft clink of calcification in moving water, the faint rasp of seaweed against a wall. In a submerged terrace, one can imagine, with some exactness, the sound of silt settling into terrace basins, a muffled, minute rain, and the small percussion of shrimp and crab as they dress the old channels. These are ecological noises that, while not human, signal the conversion of cultivated earth into marine substrate. To interpret them as sign is to allow natural history to take its proper place in human affairs. It is a matter of some scholarly debate whether the terraces in question predated or postdated certain known climatic shifts. Chronology is a patient, sometimes prickly business. Radiocarbon dates may offer centennial ranges rather than precise years. Oral history may conflate events across generations, and local practice blends seamlessly into the geological record in ways that resist neat compartmentalization. For our purposes, however, these uncertainties are fortuitous rather than obstructive. They permit us to imagine a history that is not monolithic but layered. Indeed, part of our pleasure in the Terraces story is the ease with which it refuses neat closure. I would like, with your indulgence, to present a small set of vignettes that capture the lived texture of a disappearing place, not as evidence in the forensic sense, but as sensory episodes that convey how such processes might have been experienced. They are hypothetical in their particulars, but faithful to the probable rhythms of rural life. First, imagine a family whose paddies have been slowly salted by an encroaching inlet. At first, they respond with ingenuity. They rebuild a riser a little higher, they divert a channel further inland, they adopt a rice variant that tolerates some brackishness. The soundscape is busy with action. The measured impact of a newly chiseled stone, the soft shove of a wheelbarrow over compacted path, the client's breath when he tests a seed sprout. Yet as the seasons continue to yield less, the family faces a choice. The father, practical and clear, speaks of a cousin who has taken steady work in a distant town. The mother, bound to place, speaks of a shrine that must not be abandoned lightly. The decision to leave is not made in a single cinematic scene. It is composed of small agreements, of bags packed late at night, and of a last bowl of rice left on a threshold. The auditory memory of that departure is modest, a lid closing softly, a child's small cry swallowed quickly, the faint scrape of a cart that grows more distant, and yet it marks, irrevocably, a change in the terrace's maintenance rhythm. Second, picture a year in which a market route shifts. A new road built elsewhere draws away the caravans, and with them, the occasional trader who brought tools, salt, and news. At first, the terrace's people make do. They mend what they can, barter with closer villages, sing longer at night to keep spirits up. But the absence of traders is audible. The harbor bell that once chimed now lies silent. The creak of large hulls no longer punctuates morning. Where once there were bargaining murmurs, there is now a silence that permits only domestic sound. The terraces, sustained by webs of exchange, find themselves more isolated, and isolation, practiced across seasons, can become absence. Third, imagine a ritual decision. An elder convenes, an old chant is sung, and there is a communal acknowledgement that certain low-lying terraces will be abandoned in favor of those higher on the slope. This is not an eviction, but a negotiated realignment. It allows the community to enact its grief as an ordered practice. The sound of the ritual is quiet, a low beat of a drum, the intonation of names, the passing of a bowl. It converts loss into narrative and thus into something that can be carried forward. There is dignity in such acts, and also, perhaps, a kinder way of telling history than a story that reduces people to mere victims of environmental fate. There are, inevitably, moments when evidence complicates the most elegant theory. One may find stratigraphy indicating both saline intrusion and abrupt abandonment, hinting that perhaps both environmental incursion and social stress operated together, in sequence or in concert, to produce a result neither alone could have achieved. It is reasonable, then, to consider interaction effects. A poor season might lower yield, prompting outmigration, which then reduces collective capacity to maintain risers, which then accelerates saline inundation where previously mitigations had held. Such feedbacks are familiar to anyone who studies coupled human-environment systems. They are ordinary rather than exceptional. How, then, should we speak of responsibility? The modern mind is tempted to ask who is to blame: climate change, economic policy, historical misfortune. Yet such questions, so natural to our time, risk imposing moral categories foreign to the villages we imagine. It is, perhaps, more useful to speak in terms of agency, the ways people responded, adapted, and reinterpreted their world, and to honor the forms of knowledge they exercised. Where possible, we should let the traces remain as testimonies rather than as indictments. This is an ethic of listening, not of judging. Finally, the mystery of disappearance carries a human tenderness worth remarking upon. The way people conserve memory in small, resilient practices. A woman may carry one seed variety with her when she leaves. A child may hum an old planting chant in a new place. An elder may teach the knot of a sluice even when most of the audience has left. These small acts are the human counterpoint to loss. They are channels through which continuity moves. If we imagine the terraces now, underwater or in memory, we ought to imagine them also as repositories of such private acts, the mnemonic devices by which a people refuse to be wholly erased. Let us, for a moment, conclude this meditation not with certainty, but with the mild resolution that the past, like the terraces, resists a single reading. Its disappearance is not a line, but a braided story in which sea and society and song each play a role. How we tell it depends upon what we listen for. If we listen for thunder, we will miss the drip. If we listen for spectacle, we will miss the patient economies of repair. So listen gently, now, to the image I leave you with. a riser half filled with silt, a child's palm tracing a name upon a stone, a lullaby with a new verse. Breathe. Allow the modest sounds to weave into your own breathing and, in time, to carry you toward that restful place where stories and sleep sit comfortably together. The story of rediscovery does not often arrive like a proclamation. It arrives like an interruption, a small, courteous noise in a long, patient world. Listen, a net, hauled with the customary care, tugs against something that is not fish nor snag of root, but the edge of a worked stone. The fisherman's hand, accustomed to knots and drift, pauses. The boat is held in a tiny, respectful stillness. That pause, more than any trumpet, is the moment of beginning. It is a curious fact that many archaeological awakenings begin with an accident that insists on being noticed, a shard adherent to mesh, a straight line in a scatter of reef, the faint, improbable regularity on a sonar screen. These small things, when accumulated, become a chorus that calls for closer listening. The first modern notices are, in their phrasing, almost apologetic. A logbook entry reads, "Net caught on rock," and then later, "pottery adhered." The language is spare because the recorder is careful not to overstate what might yet be misread. There is a human tenderness in that restraint. The discoverer knows the sea's inventions and is unwilling to dress a fisherman's curiosity in theatrical adjectives. It is a matter of some comfort, to me at least, that the earliest records often favor understatement. They are, in effect, invitations rather than claims. From such modest openings proceed the slow, methodical practices of confirmation. Sonar is lowered to the sea like a second, mechanical ear. Its voice is an insistently polite ping that translates depth into dots and lines on a glowing screen. Hear the machine's cadence. Ping, wait, ping, wait, and then, against the water's general murmur, a patterned return that suggests terraces, straight edges, descending shelves, an order at odds with random reef growth. The scientists around the console speak quietly. Their voices are measured because the technology yields data that must be coaxed into meaning. A sonar image is not a photograph. It is an opinion in light and echo, and it is treated as such. When divers descend to touch what the screen suggests, the sensory grammar shifts again. Underwater is not silent, but differently vocal. The diver's breathing in a regulator is a personal metronome. The bubbles a private percussion. A gloved hand brushing against an encrusted stone makes no audio on a recorder but produces, for the diver, an intake of breath that is audible to memory. Imagine the diver's descent, slow, practiced, aware, the water compressing the world into softer edges, the light thinning into blue, and then a line of stone stepping away into the silt like a human-made cliff. What is remarkable in such contact is not only the sight, but the feeling, the instant recognition that a certain regularity of cut and placement is unlikely to have been formed by chance. Touch, in these moments, is confession. A gloved palm running along a ledge reads the grooves of a tool. A fingertip finds a drill mark. A hand, with the gentleness of someone handling a sleeping animal, uncovers a scalloped edge of pottery. The diver surfaces and speaks. Their voice is hushed, variable between professional calm and private wonder. Perhaps they say, simply, "There is a step here," and in that assertion the world of the terraces returns, inch by modest inch, to human attention. The ritual of raising an object is itself a liturgy. Wrap it in plastic, bring it to the surface, place it on a padded table, note its coordinates. The conservationist movements are insistently soft. the rustle of gloves, the tap of tweezers, the hushed murmur of catalog numbers. These are the audible tokens of gentleness. Objects speak in small ways. A shard of pottery carries a fingerprint. A stirred bead reveals a thread of organic residue. A charred seed, when dated, yields a century. The ordinary assemblage that comes from submerged terraces is not spectacular. Coarse ware, a loop of fiber, a chipped pestle, perhaps a small ceramic cup whose rim fits the proportions of those found inland. Yet the ordinariness is precisely the miracle, for it allows us to reconnect, with modest means, to lives measured in repeated gestures. When a conservator unwraps a cloth-dulled bowl and finds, tucked inside, a tiny shell or a single seed, the room's hum deepens into something like gratitude. It is a soft joy, not triumph. The modern record grows from such acts. Field notebooks accumulate observational sentences, rectilinear form at 12 m, sequence of steps, each approximately 0.6 m in height. Local informant recalls old story of submerged fields. A useful scholar learns to treat each line as a tone in a chord. The geologist will look for sediment profiles and microfossils that confirm marine influence. The paleoethnobotanist will search for phytoliths or charred grains that anchor an agrarian practice in time. The oral historian will sit with elders and coax lullabies into detail. In collaborative fashion, these testimonies, instrument, earth, and voice, are set beside each other, not to silence disagreement, but to give a fuller music. There is a tenderness, too, in how local communities often participate in these rediscoveries. An elder who has told stories of sleeping steps by the hearth may be the first to point out a dark line in shallow water. A fisherman whose family has traversed the inlet for generations will recall a reef that was once a path. Their memories are not documentary proofs, but charts of practice. They tell us where to listen and how. Often the archaeologists arrive with their equipment and their hypotheses, but when they do well, they arrive with humility and with a readiness to learn the local lexicon. A respectful conversation develops. The scientist's calibrated axis meets the elder's attentive map, and a mutual translation occurs. That interchange produces another curious sound, the patient negotiation of meaning, the careful rephrasing of observation into story. The logistics of digging underwater are, thankfully, less dramatic than popular imagination suggests. Excavation proceeds in grids. A diver's tool is a trowel adapted to the medium. Silt is lifted like a gray veil and sluiced into careful sieving. Picture, audibly, the soft sucking of silt into a bucket, the measured scraping against stone, the muffled clink of labeled tags. Each recovered context is recorded with the expert's deliberate language. Context numbers, stratigraphic notes, sample bags sealed and labeled. The rain of small sounds, the rustle of maps, the click of camera shutters, the creak of a boat's frame, composes a field-seasoned soundtrack. As the body of evidence grows, so does the narrative that surrounds it. Conferences contain papers that are read in calm, punctilious tones. Journaling editors correct a phrase. A cautious sentence is reworded. One loves the paradox that scholarly publication, so often imagined as dry, can itself be an exercise in tenderness. Footnotes like careful stitches, acknowledgments like bows. The public announcement, when it eventually comes, is usually restrained. It favors phrases such as preliminary results suggest or further work required. The team is aware of the temptation to dramatize and resists it with professional modesty. This restraint is not merely politeness, but a scholarly ethic. Rediscovery does not remain confined to the professional sphere. Small, practical consequences ripple outward. A local craftsperson may rediscover an old motif and begin to weave it into new cloth. A lullaby sung at a festival may reintroduce a verse once thought lost. School children may be walked to the shoreline to be told a story that is now underpinned by a shirt in a drawer. These cultural reanimations are quiet, they are ongoing, and they are, in a sense, the most important aspect of any rediscovery. Archaeology that does not return to the community is incomplete. When objects are curated with care, when a bowl is conserved and a pattern explained in a local language, then heritage becomes not an extractive archive but a shared present. Ethical questions tinge every phase of these operations. Who owns the past? Who is permitted to carry its objects inland? These are not pedantic debates, but serious, sometimes tender, negotiations. A community that has long told itself stories of sleeping fields may rightly request stewardship of finds. Museums and universities must then navigate the balance between research and restitution. The noises of bureaucracy, meetings called in low voices, signed agreements, careful shipping arrangements for conserved artifacts, are not glamorous, but they are necessary. They represent the slow work of ensuring that rediscovery does not become appropriation. It is a curious but consoling fact that much of heritage practice now insists upon partnership, and that the quiet of a field season often ends in a careful, communal conversation about the future of an object. There are also moments of personal astonishment that one cannot quite predict. A diver recounts, in a small voice, how they brushed aside silt and found a string of beads, dull with mineral, threaded on a cord of plant fiber still clinging faintly at its knot. The conservator, with gloved hands trembling slightly, because such moments unfix even the practiced, photographs, wraps, and later, in the lab, teases the residue from the knot. The bead, when revealed, is not valuable in any market sense. It is beatific because it condenses into a single object the texture of daily life. A roomful of professionals listens, and their common intake of breath is an audible sign of wonder that requires no headline. Scholarly debate flourishes in the soft light of these discoveries. Is this bead indigenous, or made from a traded shell? Does the style of the pottery indicate contact with a coastal polity or with inland neighbors? In responding, scholars are careful to couch assertions. This may indicate one plausible reading is, and often, we cannot exclude. These phrases, hedged as they are a kind of music. The careful discipline of qualification sings a song of epistemic modesty that suits bedtime better than bombast. Technology continues to refine our hearing. Acoustic mapping, 3D photogrammetry, and even the most recent sonar innovations allow for remote reconstructions that may be shared with communities before a single pot is lifted. Imagine a projection in a community hall, a three-dimensional model of the terraces, rendered in blue and gold, rotating slowly as an elder points and says, "I remember my uncle standing here." The model is not the thing itself. It is a respectful echo that can provoke memory and invite participation without disturbance. These digital echoes produce a different sort of sound. Mouse clicks, low projector hums, soft applause, a child's delighted exclamation. They are small noises of reconnection. There are also practical choices to be made about preservation. Should a fragile site remain in situ, shielded by water, its secrets kept beneath silt, or should certain key artifacts be raised and conserved for study and public benefit? Each choice carries consequences. Water, though corrosive, is sometimes the best preservative. Some organs of culture prefer that certain structures remain submerged, accessible only to careful, local stewardship. The debates that occur in technical meetings are expressed in calm language. Risk assessment, conservation ethics, the feasibility of long-term monitoring. There is a gentle humility in those conversations, and they often conclude with contingencies rather than final pronouncements. Rediscovery can also produce modest economies. Craft revivals may flower. Small museums or interpretative centers may open with tasteful, low-key displays. Guided walking routes may be authored, always with an eye toward low impact. None of this need be tawdry. In fact, when done well, such initiatives are delicate instruments. They provide livelihood and memory, and they allow the community to tell its own story. The sound of a craft workshop, the rhythmic tap of a loom, the quiet conversation about pattern, is itself a returning chorus. And yet rediscovery does not always resolve the larger questions that drove our curiosity. Why did terraces sink where others survived? Radiocarbon dates may overlap. Isotopic analysis may suggest shifting salinities at particular times. Oral poetry may map seasons in phrases that resist tidy correlation. Science will improve our temporal resolution, and scholarship will refine models of human adaptation, but some aspects stubbornly resist reduction. There is comfort in that resistance. It reminds us that the past is not merely a problem to be solved, but a landscape to be inhabited imaginatively. In that inhabitation, we practice empathy. One small case may serve as a concluding echo. A local schoolteacher, after a season's field work, organizes a simple evening reading for children. On a low table rests a conserved bowl, its rim mended with modern repair, its interior washed and dry. The teacher tells not the press release version of events, but an old story of a child who once learned to count terraces one by reciting the names of grandmothers. A little boy, perhaps 8 years old, listens and then whispers a line he has invented himself, a verse that would have been familiar to no one yesterday, but that now enters the communal song. The room's small exhale, the murmur of assent, the tiny, delighted giggle. These sounds are what the scholar carries away as the most precious evidence. They are proof that rediscovery, when gentle, returns more than objects. It returns a place into human conversation. So the modern uncovering is, in its best form, less a returning of the past to the present than a meeting. A meeting conducted in careful accents, with instruments that are not loud, and with a humility that privileges listening. The terraces re-enter human regard not as prizes, but as interlocutors. They suggest questions more than they offer answers. And in that gentle ambiguity there is, if one listens with patience, a lullaby. The polite ping of sonar, the muted scrape of silt, the soft revoicing of an old chant, altogether composing a sound that is at once scholarly and intimate, and perfectly suited for the tired ear that wishes, tonight, to fall asleep while thinking of steps, of water, and of hands. The terraces, when one considers them at the distance of years, behave like certain small instruments. They respond to a light touch and continue to resonate long after the hand has left them. Think of that resonance as a kind of legacy, not the brittle legacy of monuments and inscriptions, but a modest inheritance of habit and rhythm. The people who labored in those steps left, perhaps, no great proclamation, but they left a way of moving through the world that persisted in song, in seam, in the choice of a rope's twist. Such persisting gestures, the way a palm knows the curve of a riser, the way a voice times the sluice, are the true heirlooms. We end Then, by listening for what remains audible after the long catalog of causes and confirmations. There are, if one sits very quietly, a handful of small sounds that one might call the terraces' after voices. One is the soft rasp of salt over stone, when waves have decided to smooth rather than to smash. Another is the distant, almost mechanical murmur of a conservation lab, where gloved fingers coax dust and incrustation from a vessel. There is, too, the warm, human murmur of an elder recounting by lamplight a line of names. Names that insist, simply, on being pronounced. Each of these noises is a form of reply to disappearance. The salt speaks of transformation, the lab bench of attention, the voice of continuity. Legacy arrives in forms both communal and private. A village may add a verse to an old song. A motif may reappear on a woven cloth. Children may be taught to count terraces as one learns a prayer. These are the public afterlives of place. Private continuities are quieter still. A woman keeps a single packet of seed from the field she left. A man hums an old irrigation chant as he mends a boat. A family preserves a bowl into which a child once spilled grain. Such objects and gestures are not museum pieces. They are living points of attachment, indexes of belonging that travel with people when they move. To the extent that legacy is about inheritance, these small things are the most tenacious heirs. It is a matter of some comfort that rediscovery sometimes allows communities to enlarge their own stories, not to have them replaced. When archaeologists and local people converse, a term I use advisedly, for it implies a mutual listening, new narratives are composed that respect both evidence and memory. A son may learn where his grandmother once said a terrace had been, and then, seeing a sonar model projected on a screen, point to a contour and say, "Yes, here, where she always said." The satisfaction in that pointing is not the triumph of science, but the reunion of memory and material. These reunions do not always resolve chronological puzzles. They do, however, repair the continuity of lives. There are practical, quotidian consequences to remember. Small heritage initiatives may spring up, undertaken with discretion rather than with fanfare. A community archive, a modest interpretive panel, a children's program that teaches the old counting songs. When such projects are steered by the people who carry the memory, they tend to be tender and prudent, designed to keep rather than to commercialize. In favorable cases, such revivals create livelihoods that do not erase tradition. Craft weaving draws upon an old motif, not because it will sell most brightly, but because it sings the terrace step into being each time a shuttle passes. Thus, legacy is not merely a residue, but an active labor, a continuation of practice in altered form. We ought, however, to keep an honest ear for the smaller dissonances that arrive with attention. Tourism, even modest, alters rhythms. The presence of outsiders changes how stories are told and sometimes shortens their breath. Research funding may privilege publication over partnership. A prized vessel may find its way to a distant cabinet and cease to speak the language of place. These are not condemnations, but reminders that tenderness in rediscovery must be actively maintained against the pressures that surround any recovered past. Good stewardship is a set of patient practices, returning duplicates to community care, bilingual signage, co-curated exhibitions, that maintain the dignity of what has been found. If one were to ask what it means, in human terms, that terraces once cultivated by many hands now rest underwater, I would answer thus. It means that the forms of attention once paid to a slope of earth were suitable to the scale of ordinary life. and that such attentions can survive displacement. The survival is not inevitable. It depends upon memory, upon works of care, upon the decisions of a few people who choose, deliberately, to carry a practice. Legacy is therefore a practice in itself, a slow, persistent act of remembering performed by voices and hands rather than by brass plaques. There is also a scholarly legacy to be borne in mind. The arc of inquiry, modest as it often is, leaves behind techniques and vocabularies that future seekers may employ. Datasets are assembled with care. Sonar grids and stratigraphic notes become part of a corpus that, in time, allows us to ask better questions about resilience and adaptation. But even scholarly legacies should be measured against the simpler, more humane index of whether a community feels itself reflected in the reconstruction. Science is at its kindest when it provides tools for remembrance rather than instruments of extraction. Then is the ethical posture we might adopt toward such places. For my part, and to speak plainly in the gentle terms we have used, it is an ethic of reciprocity, to give back, as one might, small attentions for large recoveries, to involve communities as co-authors of interpretation, to ensure that finds inform local curricula, to offer capacity building rather than merely medals. This humility recognizes that the people who inherit the sound of terraces are sometimes those who live nearest to their echo. It is kinder to listen to them before proclaiming the archival truth. Such a posture is not sentimental. It is practical and restorative. Let us turn, for a moment, to imagination as a mode of care. It is tempting, when faced with an imprint of the past, to fill the silence with elaborate stories. I do not dissuade the appetite for narrative, provided it remains attentive to particularities. A story that invents details without regard for the texture of life risks displacing the very people it seeks to honor. But a careful imaginative act, one that asks, what might it have felt like, and then listens for corroboration before insisting, can be an ethical companion to the lab of science. In other words, imagination and evidence may walk together if each keeps to a polite pace. Now, as evening deepens, consider the final, practical habit I would recommend for anyone who cares about such places. Learn the lullabies. Not the recorded ones that archaeological films sometimes play, but the human ones, the short verses that people hum while they carry water, the counting songs taught to children, the small rhymes attached to knots. They are, in their ordinariness, repositories of knowledge. Teach them to the next generation. Sing them softly. Let them underlie new practices that mutate rather than disappear. In doing so, you create a living legacy that is resistant to mere archivalism. We come, at last, to the matter of the mind that listens to this tale tonight. You have been asked to attend to slow processes, erosion measured in millimeters, decisions formed in households, the gradual migration of labor. These are not spectacular topics. They are, rather, the soft materials of history. Allow their softness to be your comfort. Allow the thought that human labor, patient, ritualized, small, can echo even beneath a calm sea to be a gentle solace. Let the terrace's step become a metronome for your breath. Inhale for the rise. Exhale for the settling. And in that cadence, as your attention lessens and the world narrows to the rhythm of inhale and exhale, imagine, for a final moment, a particular image, a stone riser, half veiled by green silt, its edge still bearing the faint thumbprint of the mason who set it, the water above it trembling with sunlight, a child in a new place cupping a single seed and naming a grandmother. These small, connected gestures, thumbprint, seed, naming, are what survival looks like on the scale of a life. They are modest miracles. Now rest. Let your breath match the terrace's old meter. Let the sea's hush carry away the day's anxieties. Let the remembered labors sing a very small lullaby into your ear. There is no need for resolution. There is only the company of memory and the slow, comforting conviction that labor, once practiced with care, persists in forms we can honor. Sleep now, in the quiet knowledge that somewhere beneath in different waves there are steps that still remember the weight of human feet, and that remembering is, in some modest measure, a kind of blessing. Good night.